Hi, I did my presentation on Gina Green, and I'm going to talk to you about what I learned about her research and why she's important to the field of applied behavior analysis. So first, a little bit of background on Dr. Green. She received her doctoral degree from Utah State University in 1986. She is a prominent researcher, especially dealing with young children with autism, and she also has been an advocate for training upcoming applied behavior analysts, as well as being an advocate for public policies regarding ABA. She, in addition to this, her biography that I found online on the APBA website said that she's held several prominent positions, including being on the board of directors for the BACB and the APBA. She's also the president of the ABAI, and she has received several different honors and awards over the past 15 years for her contributions to the field of ABA. So as I was doing my research, there were two main areas that Dr. Green had that I wanted to talk about. And one was her work with learners with autism. And there are two articles I read a few, but these two I wanted to focus on for this presentation. And the first was 3 considerations when starting interventions for learners who have been diagnosed with autism. And she says that you should focus on what the learner can do currently, their strengths, and their weaknesses. And it's important to know this because when you know what they can do, what they're strong in, and what they're weak in, you can come up with acceptable targets for them for a long-term objective, and then you can break that up into a shorter-term objectives so that as they're accomplishing these things, they can be safe, successful, and independent both in the short and in the long run. The second article I read dealt with her talking about stimulus control technology, especially matching to sample. This article also talked about some other stimulus control, like prompting and prompt fading, but I'm going to focus for time's sake just on the matching to sample part of this article. So she talked about how discrimination and matching skills are important in our daily lives, and so we definitely want our learners with autism to be able to have these conditional discrimination skills. And the difference between simple discrimination and conditional discrimination, according to this article, was that simple discrimination had 3 contingencies. You have the antecedent stimulus, the response, and the consequence. And then the conditional discrimination adds the conditional stimulus to those same 3. So there's a total of 4. And then matching to sample procedures can be used with anything that we encounter with our 5 senses. Typically, it's used for visual discrimination for what we see, and then identical non-visual, so maybe like a picture and then an item. So Dr. Green then also talks about 9 guidelines for explicitly teaching matching to sample procedures, and I'm just going to go over those 9 guidelines. The first thing she says is that a different sample should be presented on each trial, but the same comparisons should appear in every trial. Then the second thing she says is that there should be at least 3 comparisons on every trial. Guideline number 3 is that each sample should be presented equally as often within a session, and then the same sample should not be presented on more than 2 consecutive trials. The fourth thing is that the position of the conditional stimulus should vary from trial to trial. The fifth guideline is that learners should be required to make an observing response to the sample stimulus on each trial. The sixth guideline is that if the sample stimuli are auditory, they should be presented clearly to start the trial. So she suggests saying like just spoon instead of touch spoon, just so there's the fewer words the better, pretty much is what she said. Then the 7th guideline is to prepare whatever you're comparing out of sight of the student, and that's just to make sure that the student doesn't have any extraneous cues from you as you're preparing it. So if you prepare it behind a wall, out of their sight, and then give them their comparison array, that's the guideline that she suggests. The last two are you want to teach the learners how to do the MTS task before you give them a new conditional discrimination. And then you want to use errorless teaching methods instead of trial and error when you're teaching conditional discrimination. So besides working with learners with autism, Dr. Green also, what I read, she was big on licensing for applied behavior analysts as their own profession, as opposed to being licensed through an existing medical profession. Her articles that I read on licensing with her colleague Dr. Johnson talked about why licensing would be important. And so one of the things she says is that funding sources might be reluctant to pay if practitioners are not licensed. Then you want your consumers want that differentiation of the practitioners. They want somebody who's licensed, or the employer wants somebody who's licensed. The practitioners themselves also want that assurance of being able to make a living. And then the second article going along with that talked about the needs, what you would need in order to get licensed. And so the biggest thing was money, but also lobbyists. And besides lobbyists, you want to have the language in your bill already so that the legislators know exactly what you want. And if you know what the words say already, then you know that the law is going to be passed favorably to you. Also, there needs to be enough practitioners to warrant that statute. So if there's only a few practitioners who are wanting to get licensed, the government or licensing agency is going to be less likely to license you than if there's a whole bunch of practitioners who are wanting to get licensed. In addition to these things, she also wrote about the risks for getting licensed, and the biggest risk that was in there was about if you were working in one state, then the licensing laws in a different state would be, maybe different. And if you moved, you might not be able to practice, or it might be harder for you to practice if the licensing laws in the states were different. And the last thing I read about was training, and specifically training new applied behavior analysts to evaluate interventions and making sure they're effective. So she talks in this article about how it's important for us as practitioners to know the benefits and the side effects of any intervention that we're recommending to our clients. And we also need to be competent in examining and evaluating the quality of these interventions. So she suggests some things, several different competencies for ABA practitioners. And what she says is that practitioners need to have skepticism as a worldview. They need to understand the characteristics of science and the scientific method. They also need to understand how thinking goes wrong and where these fallacies come from, and then how that pseudoscience or junk science or fraudulent science, how it's harmful and why people believe it, and how is it different from the science of applied behavior analysis. In addition to that, she talks about competencies for recognizing appropriate interventions or effective interventions. And so you want to look for interventions where there's been a controlled experiment and the results are direct and observable and measurable, and that they can be replicated, and they've been peer-reviewed, and that they've been, the importance of those interventions has been written about not just for ABA, but for any case where that intervention would be effective. And then she talks about, to make sure it's also general, and the evidence of the effect has also been written about. In addition to that, the last few things that she says that new practitioners and even practitioners now should be aware of, they're being able to differentiate effective interventions from marketing hype, to make sure that there's been a sound protocol involved in that intervention. And lastly, to make sure that if that intervention is written about, that there are sources for that reliable evidence, such as peer-reviewed journals. So that is my presentation. These are the resources that I used for this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much.